of you, thank you. For those of you who are uh, bilingual or prefer to participate in Spanish, there is the option to switch on interpretation at the bottom. You should see on your Zoom panel the little globe symbol if you want to dial in and participate in Spanish. We've got wonderful Mariela interpreting for us today. So super excited to be bringing this topic to the table when sufficiency meets seawater, building a moral economy, and really bringing together the lenses of faith, finance, and the future of ocean well-being. So, lots of incredible pieces coming together where there's a much need for overlap, which I'm sure Tariq and Gopal will get into shortly. So just for those of you who have entered just now, please feel free to introduce yourselves, where you're calling in from today, and what's brought you to today's talk. Why are you here? What are you looking to gain from connecting with us today? So just to provide a little bit of context, I'm Amira. Most of you hopefully know me by now. I'm the engagement lead at WEAll, and I'll be facilitating today's conversation. So much of this feels quite close to my heart, being someone who wears multiple hats too, of wanting to weave my faith and cultural traditions into the work of protecting people on planet and prioritizing people on planet. So just to bring a little bit of context to this discussion, blue moral economies refers to economic systems that integrate ethical imperatives from diverse faith traditions with regenerative marine practices at a time when our oceans are forgotten, right? Our oceans are forgotten and neglected, and also the ecology and marine life that comes with this. And with that is also this acknowledgement that much of the world belongs to some sort of faith tradition. And there's so many values that bring together faiths that prioritize people on planet. So 85% of the world's population adheres to faith traditions, and these voices offer unique contributions through established networks that can go back hundreds of years in some cases, as well as a demonstrated capacity to influence policy and also sustain long-term commitments. The positive economic and ecological role of oceans is often underestimated, and the negative impact of our extractive economies on marine ecosystems is often unseen. We may spot this sometimes if we're walking along a beach or we go into the water and, we stumble upon some litter, for example, or, we might be sitting in a restaurant somewhere and the fish that you're used to being able to consume is no longer available because of overfishing. But often the effects on the ocean are unseen. Oceans generate livelihoods and food and nutrition for over a third of humanity and play an important regulatory role in terms of absorbing CO2 emissions. Effective marine protection is vital for long-term economic, social, and planetary well-being, for securing food and livelihood for so many peoples, indigenous peoples, coastal communities, as well as for addressing the climate crisis. So where does this come together? How does this fit with a well-being economy? A blue moral economy is like a well-being economy lens applied to oceans, right? That's a short way that I'd describe it. Which make up 70% of the planet's surface. So when we talk about, prioritizing people on planet, we're talking about something that is 70% of the planet's surface. Emphasizing things like stewardship over ownership, sufficiency over endless unsustainable extraction, ethical considerations over profit, and the participation of the very communities that we've just mentioned that benefit from the marine ecosystem. So our fishing communities, indigenous peoples, and the coastal populations. Now, faith traditions recognize oceans as sacred commons that sustain all life. Economic perspectives obviously vary across faith traditions, cultural contexts, and philosophies, but this work has needed much more attention than it's had over previous years. And many of us may not be connected to a faith tradition, but we can say there are moral values that dictate and shape our views, lives, and interaction with nature and the oceans. And so, with that, um, I'd like to introduce our wonderful speakers today. We have Gopal Patel, who serves as a coordinator for the Faiths for UNOC 3 campaign. And for the past 15 years, he's helped bridge the gap between the world of faith, spirituality, and the secular world to address environmental changes. He has advised global interfaith and environmental initiatives and worked for the inclusion of faith voices in local and international policy. And he shares his experience as a keynote speaker and presenter and convenes spaces for faith and secular groups to engage constructively on issues of common concern. And he does have a TED Talk, which I hope Tariq will sneak into the chat, or Tobile, hopefully, so that you can check that out after today's call. And secondly, we have Tariq Al-Olaimy, who serves as a lead coordinator for the Faiths for UNOC 3 campaign. And many of you will already know him as a very active WEAll member through Recipes for Wellbeing. He's a social entrepreneur from the island of Bahrain with expertise in the blue moral economy. He brings extensive experience bridging communities with global economic and environmental initiatives. And he serves on the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Faith in Action and is an Islamic advisor to Greenpeace MENA. His advisory board roles include the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, UN Climate Change High Levels Champions Race to Resilience, and the World Economic Forum Foundations. And Tariq beautifully also champions integrating spiritual infrastructure with ecosystem restoration, often in an incredibly articulate way. So very, very pleased to have both of you on today's WEAll Talk. And I will hand over to Gopal to introduce the history of this work and where it's come from.
Thank you very much, Amira, and everyone at the WEAll community for having us today. I should also say that Tariq also has a TED Talk, but his is not published just yet. It'll be coming out in a short month, so we can look forward to that. But it's a delight to be here to share about the work that Tariq and I and others have done earlier this year around mobilizing faith communities and leaders for UNOC 3, which was the UN Ocean Conference, the third one that took place in June in Nice in the south of France. So I'm going to share a little bit of context in terms of why we mobilized faith actors for that conference, some of the things we did there, some of the insights that we learned from faith communities before I hand over to Tariq, who will speak more specifically around the blue moral economy. As you mentioned, Admira, they say 85% of the world's population belong to some faith group or some value system. And we know that through that, there are many ways that faiths are influential. We recognize that they have a moral authority when it comes to certain issues in the world. We recognize that faith communities have cultural and spiritual connections with nature and all of the natural world and other people. And we also recognize critically that faiths also have extensive networks and reach to almost every local community in every corner of the world. And so oftentimes it's asked, why work with religious groups when it comes to environmental issues? And my answer is, why not? They are some of the largest civil society stakeholders the world has ever seen. And they have been around, as you mentioned, Amira, for hundreds of years and will be around for many hundreds of years to come. And so they should be a natural partner and ally for work we do when it comes to oceans or climate or the economy or any concern that we're looking to address. A challenge oftentimes, though, and this is the work that Tariq and I do, is how to effectively mobilize faith-based organizations and leaders. And when it came to this issue of the ocean, we were a bit stumped because, speaking for myself, I come from the climate space, the biodiversity and nature space, and I've done a lot of work around mobilizing faith groups in those spaces. But last year, Bloomberg Philanthropies and the Bloomberg Ocean Fund specifically asked if we would help them and work with them to mobilize faith actors around oceans. And now I come from England. England is a small island state, but it's not a small island state. We don't think of ourselves as an island in England in many ways. And so I didn't really know much about the oceans. And so this experience for me has really been a learning. And for many of the faith groups we've worked with, there's been a learning around what are the issues concerning the ocean? Because as you mentioned, Amira, they take up 2/3 of the planet, but we know very little about what's happening in the oceans. And when we undertook this work, we found out that there is significant work going on around the world when it comes to faith action on ocean conservation. We found that faith groups, when they engage in ocean conservation, are more resilient to funding and political shifts. We found that their engagement at the local level is more sustained and more effective. We found that, contrary to maybe popular belief, they are strong adherents to conservation standards. And as we would assume, they go beyond just the technical and move into the heart and the spirit space, which is really what is needed to sustain this work for the long term. And so at UNOC 3, we had a number of interventions. This photograph here that you can see on your screen is one of my highlights from the conference. We brought a number of high-level faith leaders to France for the conference. And after the first day, we went to the ocean there in Nice, and we did an interfaith prayer service where we had a Muslim, Hindu, Christian, Jewish, Sikh, and Buddhist leaders all saying prayers in their respective traditions to the ocean. And as you can see, as we were saying the prayers, the water kept rising and rising, and at one point it was coming to touch the toes and the feet of all the religious leaders, which we kind of considered to be an auspicious sign that the ocean was reciprocating with the prayers that were being said. And so we brought some faith leaders to the Ocean Conference, but it wasn't just to show that faiths were there, but it was actually to engage in the policy conversations and to say that the faiths had something meaningful to contribute to the deliberations that were going on there. And so if we go to the next slide, please. One of the key things we brought to the Ocean Conference was the first ever global interfaith declaration on the ocean. We called it Turning the Tide. And this was the first time that representatives from every single religious tradition from across the world signed and endorsed a statement for protecting the ocean. At the end, we had over 300 signatories from every corner of the world, from every religious tradition. And this was a key moment of our participation there. We also had the opportunity to hand this declaration over in person to Inga Anderson, who's the head of the UNEP, and Peter Thompson, who's the UN ambassador to the ocean. And the policy asks that were in the declaration, if we go to the next page, we were to see them. The policy asks in the declaration spoke directly to what are the main concerns when it comes to the ocean and what was on the table there at UNOC 3, which was protecting 30% of our oceans, supporting the moratorium on deep sea mining, implementing the High Seas Treaty, the BBNJ, addressing marine pollution, and critically recognizing that the ocean has a role in climate action as well. And so these are the policy asks that we came to the table with in France. And in the next slide, you will see just a snapshot of some of the organizations that endorsed this declaration. Huge organizations such as the World Evangelical Alliance, the Anglican Communion, Religions for Peace, Green Faith, the Parliament of World Religions, the Brahma Kumaris. Significant major global organizations signed this for the first time, and history was very much made there. We also had a number of side events where we engaged with policymakers and other civil society actors around the role of faith and values when it comes to ocean conservation. And we also convened for the first time at a UN conference, a faith house, where we had a dedicated space in the heart of Nice that was open every day throughout the conference, where people could come for events that we curated there, but also come for some meditation, for some yoga, or just this cup of tea or some juice to kind of step away from the day-to-day of the conference. So it was a hugely successful intervention by faith groups there. And now we're looking very much towards, what is next. And one of the things we launched there, which I want to speak to now, are 10 inner principles for ocean protection. Because as I mentioned, much of this work, there's an external nature to it, and there's also an internal nature, and then it becomes eternal. And so what is that internal work that is needed in order to protect our oceans? And so if we go over the next two slides, you'll see the 10 principles in brief. Next one again, please. And again, one more time. Thank you. So there are 10 principles, and I'm going to highlight 5 of them before I hand it over to Tariq. And these 10 that we've launched and the 5 that I'm going to highlight now are very much an invitation for a conversation and to see how they resonate with people and see how we can start normalizing these perspectives when it comes to our ocean action, whether we're doing it from a faith lens or not. The first, as I mentioned just a second ago, is this concept of inner and outer harmony, that our inner world is deeply connected to the outer world and they both influence each other. And therefore, we need to tend to both. And I think a lot of us, probably why we're in spaces like this, is that oftentimes we see that a lot of climate activism and kind of social change work is so focused on the outer that the inner becomes neglected. And what we're saying is here is that the outer is just as important as the inner. Move to the next slide, please. Humility before depths. Again, these principles draw from the ocean and what lessons we take from the oceans. So recognizing just as the ocean is deep and, I think we know more about outer space than we know about our oceans. That's how unknown the ocean is. So how can we have humility that there is wisdom and teachings and lesson and love here in the oceans that we just don't know? And how do we have the humility to recognize that before we can even think about trying to care for the ocean? Next one, please. Recognizing that the ocean is a teacher and a voice, a guide, a guru. The oldest civilizations in the world came up on the banks of oceans and rivers. They obviously learned something by being by those big water bodies. So how can we open ourselves up to the wisdom of the ocean? Next one, please. How can we have active compassion for the ocean? And this one's a really important one because I think for many of us, definitely for myself, I live mostly disconnected from the ocean. I live just outside of New York City. Again, I don't think of the ocean as being close to me, but it is. I don't really feel like I have an active relationship with the ocean. So how can I develop a sense of compassion for the suffering that living beings are facing in the ocean, and also that communities are suffering due to the effects of the ways that we're treating our oceans? So how do we develop a sense of active compassion for what is happening with the oceans? And then finally, how can the oceans be a source of joy? Because again, anything we do has to have a sense of joy. Otherwise, it just becomes boring and dull, right? And so honoring the sea as a shared global commons, deserving collective care and celebrating its beauty. I think that is really at the heart of what we're trying to do, is bring a sense of love and joy to the work around caring for the oceans. So I'm going to pause there and hand it over to my brother Tariq, who will take us on the next journey. Over to you, Tariq.
Thanks so much, Gopal. Salam, friends. Wonderful to see you all and some familiar faces. Calling in, representing the island of Bahrain. And whilst Gopal has talked about New York, even living on an island, sometimes you lose touch as well with the water bodies around you. No matter how close the water may be physically to you, you can still be so disconnected, as I know many of us are. And whilst Gopal is giving you the wisdom, I'll try to bring the economics. I know partly why we're here is because we need a little bit more wisdom in economics. And I'll speak to where does this all intersect with the well-being economy movement. I think where Gopal sort of ended regarding, we know so little about our ocean. As someone who's been very active in the well-being economy space, in the degrowth space, in the post-growth spaces, I think there's only ever been one major conversation I've had around the ocean. To many of us, plankton is invisible. And of course, plankton is neither progressive or conservative. It simply photosynthesizes. And without that one plankton, all of our beautiful theories about economics, the world, the spirit, our built environment all collapse without this beautiful thing. And it's on this planet where plankton generates roughly half of the oxygen that we breathe. And it's this question that has come up again and again in this work of, it's remarkable how often our economic reimagining stops at the shore, that it doesn't continue there into the ocean. And we do such a wonderful job, I think, collectively as a community around sufficiency and well-being and challenging the growth myth on land, yet leave the ocean in business as usual mode. And this is where some of these deeper conversations around the blue moral economy have started, because this blind spot matters. And it's something in which one of our faith leaders had said that if you ignore this blue half of the earth, our transition risks washing away like a sandcastle at high tide. It's really like that. No matter how much we want to work on this broader transition, if we as well-being economy advocates don't take the ocean into account, into our practices, into our imaginaries, there's no way that we're going to be getting to the world that we know that we can creatively create together. And it's where it's very simply that framing is something that inspired us and inspired many faith leaders. We also know it inspires blue degrowth advocates as well, because in mainstream blue growth discourses, the ocean is, again, like land, constructed as this new economic frontier that's able to provide business opportunities. You've heard blue growth frameworks as well, and saying that we can both do that, yet simultaneously conserve marine ecosystems as well. You may be familiar with, the green growth initiatives that have been surrounding you, and very similarly over the last 2 years, blue growth initiatives have come up in meeting that parallel. Market incentives coupled with technological innovation that are supposed to allow the ocean to develop sustainably to benefit coastal communities along the way. Those very same discourses are used in the ocean conservation. And we know, as with the green growth agenda, they also don't apply and work for the blue growth agenda. We've had a lot of economic researchers like Marios Hadmichael, who've coined this term blue degrowth, that have been calling for reduced extraction and greater ecological and cultural value of the sea, some of the points that Gopal had said. And what we've tried with the blue moral economy is take this one step further. Where blue degrowth says less extraction, the blue moral economy finishes the sentence with, because the ocean is a sacred commons, not this warehouse. And this distinction matters, if you learn, because we move from just managing decline to building a more regenerative ocean economy to both serve human well-being, ecological health, but also to take care of the more than human world. And we undertook this interesting experiment of, what if we started to look at what, as Gopal was saying, as we started to look at what faith-based communities were doing around ocean action, what are the types of economics that are underlying that? What is driving the models, the frameworks, the finance systems, the market-based approaches? How, as faith communities, are protecting species, coastal cities and areas? Were they engaging with economics, and what was fundamentally driving it? And as we found, looking at from backwards place, we found that, and no surprise, the moral economy and how they defined it was based on spiritual cultural values. All faith-based projects on oceans looked at the ocean as a source of inspiration, identity, and connection first. It was also an economics of relationship. It was the ocean as connector of peoples and communities across space and time. The ocean also for faith communities had intrinsic and also existence values, that there is this recognition that marine life has inherent worth. And of course, there was this intergenerational perspective. The ocean was our shared inheritance for future generations. And whether we looked at Islamic, Jewish, Buddhist, Baha'i communities and beyond, all of these different principles really were emerging as the same. Next slide, Amira, please. And we started to look at what were these different principles that then guided the best practice case studies. And we've put into the chat some of the primers. And very similarly, we created a report that was around this. And I'll share that as well into the chat. It's the Blue Moral Economy primer, which you can find in the same link above. And then you'll find in oceans.faith/reports some of these case studies, which we've looked at faith communities engaging in marine protected areas, protecting turtles, specific species. And you'll see some of these things on the slide, which look honestly very familiar, I think, to every single person on this call. That when we started to look at what this blue moral economy was, where it already existed, that you had 7 key principles. That it was nature positive rather than merely sustainable. All the best practice case studies aimed for outcomes where human activities actively restore and enhance biodiversity, leaving marine ecosystems in a better condition. We found that they were also purpose-driven rather than profit maximizing, measuring success by contribution to human dignity, measuring success based on community flourishing, measuring success on this intrinsic value that was brought both to creation, to God, and to the more than human world. And I think that last point is something that really surprised us. Whilst we may not have found some of those same themes maybe in land-based work and the climate movement, honestly, sometimes it is very human-centric. When it came to the blue economy, when it came to projects relating to the sea and to the ocean, it was very more than human-focused. The lens was not human-centric, but it was really looking at the wider intrinsic web of life. And our hunch was because there was such a steep connection to the coast and to the sea. It was also sufficiency oriented rather than growth dependent. There really was this, there is enough for all rather than endless accumulation, especially when it came to communities who are relying obviously on the ocean for their livelihood. It was stewardship based rather than ownership focused. And many of the models that we looked at, it was based on the commons, which was the 7th principle. And also it was circular rather than linear in approach. So there was a number of faith communities that engaged in previous COPs, UNOCs, biodiversity conventions and conferences. And anytime they talked about the ocean, it was always in terms of circularity, of design economic activities to regenerate rather than deplete natural systems. Now, why we found this quite interesting was you could put this on the WEAll principles and it's pretty much the same. And it was when you start to do this in the opposite direction and look at what faith communities were doing, what were their principles around the blue moral economy, how they were engaging in projects, the alignment is quite astounding. And what is even more astounding is that this isn't theoretical. I know sometimes it's difficult to start to get into the theory of the Wellbeing Economy, what it actually looks like, how it can be enacted in practice. And in this perspective, we found the blue moral economy, found the Wellbeing Economy alive. You know, in Tanzania, on the Masali Island, you had Islamic leaders declare Himma, a sacred protection zone, in that area, and found that coral cover, as a result, rebounded from 31% to 45%. We found that 82% of fisheries and fishermen voluntarily abandoned destructive practices compared to less than 30% compliance with government regulations in other similar areas. In Cambodia, we found Buddhist monks who are protecting Mekong dolphins who achieved a 45% reduction in illegal fishing between 2012 to 2020, which stabilized populations after decades of decline in traditional conservation approaches. In Brazil, close to where COP30 will take place, Catholic communities established 28 marine reserves protecting 1.1 million hectares, and a lot of that leading eventually 32% higher fish stocks of unprotected areas as well, secured livelihoods of 60,000 families. And this pattern was, I mean, incredible to us. You know, values-based approaches delivering sustained results through political and economic transitions, through economically sustainable approaches, through a wellbeing economy approach, really living and alive, without any single person telling them through a PowerPoint like this, or any other inherent wisdom other than really living their scripture alone. And to go back to what Gopal said of, you know, why is it important to engage faith-based organizations? Yes, they are this incredible reserve of capital. They're the 3rd largest investing group. They control at least $5 trillion in assets, 4 trillion alone with Islamic finance. They own 5% of all commercial forests. We know that there are significant economic actors, but many institutions are significant economic actors. And we found that in this case, when institutions think in centuries rather than quarters, we see what fundamental shift is possible. And we've been very excited with working with these constituencies, both to accelerate this work, these examples, these approaches, but also to really bring this approach to the well-being economy movement to say it is possible if we take the ocean into account in our own work. We have real case studies, real projects, real examples of what it can look like, how it can look like, how it can feel. But it's going back to what Gopal said of the inner and the outer. It's one of the very, very few areas for us in which this deep, inherent spiritual connection that I think we all feel with this work that we do can come so deeply alive. I think the purpose of why we want to bring this today is, one, want you to read the report to look at what this can look like in your work, but also that if, and I suspect many of you have this inkling towards a spiritual tradition, otherwise you may not be doing well-being economy work at all, this is an opportunity to bring it in harmony, in a place in which I know many of us either are not very familiar with, or are very familiar with from a scientific lens. And there's this re-invitation to do it from a spiritual ecology perspective, and also in a place in which we can really amplify within the Wellbeing Economy movement. So I'll finish there with this quote of, this transition to a wellbeing economy can't succeed on land alone. We know that by recognizing the oceans as a sacred commons, we know that if we bring this work in, it is essential to this transition. And I'll end it there, and I know we can have a conversation around this. Thank you for listening.
Thank you both so much. There was so much shared there, and two incredible pieces of research, which have been worked on for a very, very long time. I'm going to kick us off with some questions, and I'm going to invite the participants today to share questions that they might have. So if you do have a question, please feel free to raise your hand, or your Zoom hand, or to post it in the chat. We'll come back to the recommendations, Alison, as well, because I think that was actually my first question, Tariq, was when we talk about outcomes of the UNOC 3 gathering, and the Global Plastics Treaty, what still needs to be done and what can be done? That was the first question that I wanted to bring to you. I'll just open up that slide as well, the last slide.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit more to this. To try to keep it simple, and also in what we were advocating for in UNOC, one, it's include the ocean in every well-being economy post-growth manifesto. So whenever you argue for lower material throughput, whether it's in food or energy or housing, as I know many of you do, add this blue chapter to it. I think sometimes it can be simple as that. Sufficiency ends at the shoreline only if plankton, corals, small-scale fishers are made invisible. And if you make them visible in your work, that's always number one. And to take care to include the ocean in everything that you do, because there is this connection. The second was around subsidies. So we know that there's 22 billion in harmful subsidies that are currently gone to destructive fishery practices. And we know that capacity enhancing support keeps these subsidies in check. We know that campaigns can redirect some of this public money to coastal food sovereignty, gear transition, habitat recovery. A shout out to people like Greenpeace, who are doing excellent work during UNOC, who ran campaigns around targeting these subsidies. And if you work for a public advocacy organization, really focusing on this and the power dynamics related to this is important. Third is supporting a justice first high seas treaty. The high seas treaty, or the oceans treaty, as you may have heard, is this global treaty that is currently up for ratification. And ratification drives protection across 61% of the ocean. And sometimes you may hear controversies around that treaty. And I think for us, it's important to ensure, yes, it is ratified and it's important to have those legal agreements in place. But for well-being advocates, to also ensure that it needs to include deep bans on deep sea mining, a seat for Indigenous peoples at every decision table, often who are coming from spiritual Indigenous traditions. That yes, we need a high seas treaty, but it needs to be enacted in a justice first, Indigenous sensitive way. Fourth, it's you'll see this backing community governed 30 by 30 zones, and essentially it's these marine protected areas. And you'll see many things around marine protected areas, and quantity without quality is always blue washing. And I think anytime you see or engage or work on marine protected areas or find communities that are trying to engage with it, it needs to make sure that these marine protected areas include coastal peoples, small-scale fishers, the more than human world, so the wonderful more than human and rights-based work that people like the Earth Rule Center are working on. We're very present as well at UNOC, that it includes those different perspectives. And this is, I think, where this values-based approach really can come to life as well, when it can advocate for often that which is being invisibilized, but obviously is present. Fifth is the moral voice and authority. Saying no to blue bond offsets, yes to that justice. We found that at UNOC, it was the faith leaders, it was those voices who are the strongest against financialized nature swaps, often in a world and a space where we recognize it's sometimes difficult for the scientists and economists to push back for whatever political reason. It was the faith leaders who are driving a very clear voice that we cannot engage in the type of extractive practices that have often be found in land. And the sixth is very similar to the first, integrate blue well-being metrics. When you talk about tonnage and GDP or going beyond GDP, include the other indicators that matter to the ocean: fish biomass recovery, seagrass carbon drawdown, cultural heritage continuity. Include these metrics in the work that you do. There is, of course, the donut, in which I know many of you love, and there's the blue donut as well that exists. Integrate those approaches equally as well. And if you find yourself talking about going beyond GDP, know that all of those indicators exist also for the ocean. And these are some of the things that I think for your advocates, you can advocate for consistently, include, no matter if you're an independent researcher, campaigner, economist, and beyond. So yeah, that's what I'd say is some of the practical ways, and trying to keep it short and something that obviously is a very long report, and we welcome you to read the reports as well.
Brilliant. So multiple pathways there in terms of how you can advocate in whatever capacity that you advocate for a well-being economy, how you can advocate for a blue moral economy too. Thank you so much. I want to open up the floor to any questions from the audience. I know you've been going along and responding to some of the queries in the chat, so thank you for that. But does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask? Or any comments just in terms of, where this has resonated for you? Fatma Zahra, do you want to go? Lovely to see you.
Hey, Tariq. Hey, Gopal. I actually have a question around working with faith communities. Like, how do you involve faith groups and communities into conversations and spaces with groups and voices that are not exactly the friendliest or like the most welcome into like faith-based conversation, like faith to be included in that space? So how do you bring these two kind of different elements together and then have them move forward towards this desirable future that we're working towards? So kind of like lessons from your work, from your observations, and how we can also maybe migrate these practices and like get inspired from these practices and apply them in different spaces and environments and sectors.
I can go first, and then Tariq. Hi, Fatima Zara. A simple way is no crazies. We know in religious communities there are crazy people left, right, and center. You don't have to go far on a Friday, Saturday, or Sunday to meet a crazy person at your place of worship. But in seriousness, it's about finding the allies and finding the people that we know are going to be suitable for these kinds of partnerships. It's not for your average person at the mosque or the synagogue or the gurdwara or the temple, right? So it's like finding the right person within the religious institution. And oftentimes it's not the clergy. So oftentimes it's not someone who officially represents the tradition or the place of worship, but it's like a worshiper that is coming once a week or once a month or so on. So it's finding the right kind of ally on the faith side. And on the secular development side, finding those people who have an interest or are open to partnership, right? Again, because science-based organizations, finance-based organizations, they're not set up necessarily to engage with people of faith and spirit, but they'll have partnership directors, they'll have like networks, they'll have like openings, not like career openings, but like openings or pathways to explore partnerships, right? So it's about finding out where that connection is. And then recognizing on both sides, it's not about pushing the faith, it's about pushing the policies that you're trying to work towards, right? And so that's what we very much focus on. And so when you see our interfaith statement, it's focused on policy. There's some faith language there, and actually some major faith groups didn't sign it because it wasn't faith forward enough. But we're not here to like talk about how good faith is. We're here to talk about the ocean and what we can do to protect the ocean. And so when you have that goal in mind, oftentimes faith people think, oh, it's an opportunity to spread my faith and get on Instagram and speak at the General Assembly. No, it's about the policy and the work we want to do together. And I think if you can keep that centered, then you'll weed out the crazies and you'll find the right people that will want to do the work. But Tariq may have some inside baseball information for you on that as well.
Thank you, Gopal. I'm now wondering who are the crazies that are in your orbit. I think what I'd also add to that, and I'd maybe talk about maybe more traditional actors. So a lot of the work that Gopal and I do are also engaging what we kind of call at the intersection of the systemic sacred, where you have these forces of public and private sector's ability to reorganize global resources. And you try to then essentially combine that with faith and its power to shape values and mobilize also its own vast physical infrastructure. And we often talk when it comes to non-faith forward, organizations or stakeholders, we do sometimes start with talking about spiritual infrastructure, recognizing that often, faith groups have a media infrastructure that is larger than any mainstream media network in the world. As I said, they're one of the largest investment groups in the world. Often, and as you'll know, the work they also do for Zahra is when there is crisis, it is often faith-driven communities who are there as the first responders. They offer this vast infrastructure as a civil society actor, as a humanitarian actor, as a restoration actor that has often gone unrecognized. And it often has gone unrecognized because of the humility of many of these organizations who obviously don't speak to this. What we've learned is, one, I think sometimes highlighting that in a way that makes sense to, if it is business, if it is the public sector, others, making them understand in the context of what that looks like, I think one. Two, even when we do that, being very unapologetic of the values. Often it's a struggle where, in some of the actors that we engage with, Gopal and I won't name names, or the institutions, we're often told when they come to a meeting that's around faith and ecology of don't mention prayer, don't mention religion, don't speak about spirit. We're often told that, and one, we need to push back on making sure that that is still present in some way, but it's then recognizing that it's coming from a place of people have very complex relationships with religion. And I think part of where I think the crazies comment also comes in is that is very triggering to people often. And I think it's that I found is the challenge. And I think finding the right partners is important that are not going to bring up, honestly, the childhood trauma that someone has maybe with a Catholic school that they went to or the Islamic education that they're raised up with. It can trigger so much, and we never know where we often step on that, emotional landmine for people. So it's also recognizing that, for us, we're not here to as much as we'd love to spend time speaking about the spirit, we're not here to do that work. And where I think that comes from as well, and why I'd plus one that is, it's coming from just a trauma-informed space. Faith communities have caused much damage in the world as well. They've colonized and are responsible for colonization. And when we engage with indigenous actors, we have to indeed go in with a lot of humility. And I guess the longer form to this answer is in the report, in the 10 inner principles, we kind of highlight what the practical application is around these principles. And I think you'll find, more of what we're referring to there. Great to see you.
Beautifully articulated and touching on the sensitivity of faith and spirituality for so many of us as well. So thank you. Rebecca has a question. Rebecca, if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Thank you. Sorry for not being able to figure out how to raise my hand.
No worries.
So yeah, I guess I love this. I'm coming at it, I suppose, from a perspective of I'm a scientist. I work in marine conservation as a scientist. And I'm officially not religious. So I guess it relates to the previous question about how you get people together. One thing that obviously concerns me greatly about overexploitation of the seas and all the many pressures that marine ecosystems face is that our solutions need to be evidence-based. So as scientists, as the ecologists who are working out how that could work, how that ought to be done, what should not be done, a huge amount of work goes into that, and unfortunately it's mostly ignored by those in power because it doesn't fit in with whatever other priorities they might have. So it's really interesting to me to see a different way of coming at that. But I guess I'm also conscious that there might be seen to be a disconnect between a scientific approach and a faith-based approach. And I think that's a real problem, because I think the lack of sort of being able to be emotional and appeal to that spirit in people with scientific communication is hindering getting people to listen to us. And at the same time, there may be conflict between, you were talking about emotional landmines and things. People may find it difficult to relate from one side or the other. They see that as a divide, science versus religion. And I think, I guess it's a question of how you can best bring those together. And I think from my perspective, I think it has something to do with interconnectedness. So one of the greatest failings, I think, in the way we look at the world and our economy and everything is that we're not seeing the interconnectedness of our lives with functioning ecosystems and how that all connects. It's not a pick or choose situation. And perhaps that's very difficult to get people to understand, maybe with the backgrounds and the upbringings we've had, but perhaps the faith-based approach can help to make that connection, because that's what that's about, connection. Rambling, sorry.
Gopal, do you want to lead the way with this one?
Oh, sure, happy to. Thank you, Rebecca, for that. I think you said so much there, and it sounds like you already have the answer from what you were saying. So all I'll add is something we shared earlier, which is just I think for these partnerships and these dialogues to work, there needs to be a level of humility on both sides. And I think a lot of the tension between the scientific community and the religious community is because oftentimes they both think they're right, and they both think like they have a monopoly on the truth and wisdom. you know, and it leads to that friction, and it leads to many of the challenges we're seeing in the world today. And so I think if there's humility on both sides, recognizing that neither side has all the answers, neither side can do it all by themselves, that they have to work together with each other. I think that can lead, and that can be a pathway for that dialogue and that cooperation that you're talking about.
And I'll just add a partner that we've learned a lot from in this is Irusha. They're also featured in the report, but they, I think, are the best organization I can think of that blends in, you know, science-based marine conservation with, in their case, you know, their Christian faith, and, you know, their perspective of restoring the hidden things of God in the ocean. And yet every single person on their team is a trained marine biologist who leads this and is coming up from a scientific perspective and don't see a conflict in their inner world around this, and therefore don't bring that conflict as well to their outer work. So we've learned a lot from them.
Thank you so much for your question, Rebecca. Simon, do you want to respond? Is that a response or a question?
Oh, yeah, I don't actually have a question, but I wanted to explore more this idea of, because connection, Rebecca's point about connection is one of the we all needs. We see connection as being so central to what we need, what we all need. And just listening to that thought, and also listening to you, Tariq and Gopal, you're pioneers in this field, really, and we wanted to celebrate that as well. You know, we've got so much to learn about this, but it struck me that oceans are like a metaphor as well. You know, an ocean is made up of drops of water, right? But the problem is drops of water see themselves as drops of water. They don't see themselves as part of the ocean. I mean, I'm using this as a metaphor for the way the world works, right? So, you know, ego takes over, and this separation of the drop in the ocean with the ocean is part of the problem. So we sort of this idea of the disconnect between ourselves and others, and between ourselves and nature seems to be central to the problems we're trying to address. And that's independent of faith perspectives. I mean, it feels like that's very central to different faith perspectives, but it's irrespective of faiths. It's something that's that affects us all universally. It was a comment, not really a question, but I love that the way that conversation was going. Yeah.
There is another question that relates to that in the chat, so I'm just gonna raise it here. So the person asks, I'm curious about your thoughts on why we as a society often view the ocean and nature more broadly as separate from humanity, and how this perspective might shape the decisions we make about them. So this touches a little bit on the point, Gopal, that you made earlier about disconnect, even for a lot of city dwellers, right? In terms of like the ocean is so far away. So yeah, I'm not sure if we have any comments on that one. And one of the other questions that I've wanted to raise to everybody in the chat is if we do want to rectify this, so exactly the challenge that we're talking about here of this separateness, how do we lean into ocean and its life source? You know, what does it look like for you? What could it look like for you in your day-to-day life? What could it look like for you to lean into ocean and ocean life and its source, or even embody some of these inner principles that have been shared today? So that's an invitation of a question that Tariq and Gopal have formed for you all. So please feel free to put your responses in the chat to that one as well. So yeah, I'm not sure if there's a response to, you know, what is quite a broad debate, but, you know, why are we disconnected? Why do we see, you know, the ocean as outside of ourselves? You know, is there any learnings that you can bring from what you've heard? You know, when, you know, there is quite a difference in meeting with faith communities or faith activists who might be, you know, intrinsically very connected, and then, you know, trying to bridge that gap in mainstream spaces.
So I can have a go at maybe linking the two and then see if Tariq has something to say. A lot of the faith actors we bought, well, not actually a lot, well, a good number of them said like they had never thought about the ocean before. And they actually appreciated the fact that we were talking about the oceans because it's something that actually a lot of religious traditions don't acknowledge or don't really have a theology or a philosophy or understanding around. And so faith actors are coming to this in some ways fresh, just like many of us are as well, that, oh, we don't even think about this. In terms of why it's disconnected, I think we all know the answers. Rebecca's put it in the chat. Our economic systems kind of externalize nature, don't take into account, the immense benefit that we take from nature. In terms of how we do it, like I've made a commitment to like start connecting with the ocean. So a couple of weeks ago, I went to Florida, met my scuba diving rabbi friend, and we did a practice scuba session. And then we went out on the ocean for a day just on his boat. And I spent a whole weekend on the water, something I've never done in my life after growing up in Northwest London. And so I'm recognizing that I need to actually go out there and kind of expose myself to nature and specifically to the ocean if I want to have a sense of actually, what this huge energy is. So that would be a suggestion is like, let's get out there and let's kind of get on the water or in the water and kind of feel it and touch it. That would be a suggestion.
Tariq, did you want to respond? Or okay, great. So we have time for one last question. Brigitte, I see your hand raised if you'd like to unmute yourself. Oh,
Can
we
you hear
still
me?
can't. Yes, now we can. We can hear
Okay,
you.
yeah. I just I'm sorry that I was late. I was always interested in your arguments. Yeah, just wanted to add something that it might be something new that there's science on one hand and spirituality on the other hand, but actually talking like economists and studied all that growing laws for economy. Adam Smith, they said, whenever there is no rational argument, there's always the spirituality, the invisible hand. I don't know if you ever heard of it. So it's actually nothing new that you have on one side this limited thoughts of science, because there's a mechanism in the universe that that is never experienced by scientists. And actually, there's so much to learn, and especially from the women's view, because all reason is based on the limited thoughts of men. And of course, they didn't know other, but actually 50% of the knowledge, precious knowledge of women is missing in the whole database. So I just want to add this, if you might consider this, because women's scientists and knowledge and wisdom has never been actually asked, and it's hard to find things. So that's what about all what we can, maybe change our habits, and to, instead of external growth, we grow internal in a way. We don't have to go to the Mars or to the moon to get some excitement feelings. So we would save our planet just changing our habits and, I don't know, train our brain in different parts. So that's what I wanted to say, that everybody could actually just change habits and change goals, that you don't need a house and you don't need to go to the Amazon with Bezos and his wife, and they have to go to Mars, please. I mean, I'm German and we have to collect our garbage, and we have to save water, and we have to save energy. So that's the rule in Europe. So
Brilliant.
I wanted to add that.
Well, a much needed way for us to close today too. That reminder that, this is not so far from us. We've just opened up this topic today, but it is in the small ways, in our day-to-day individual actions, in how we spend time and be in communion with nature, with the sea, with the marine ecosystem, in our small ways, that we can embody some of these principles and start to bring more attention to what is, quite an underestimated part of the change that needs to be made. So thank you both so much. Thanks everybody for your active participation, for your questions. There's been lots of great chat in the chat. So we'll hopefully look to potentially bring something like this back next year as well. And yeah, just a massive thank you to our faith champions who, as always, never cease to inspire us with the work that they do. So I hope that you leave equally as inspired as me today, and we hope to see you next month for our WEAll Talk. Thanks so much.
Bye. Bye now.